The chains bite into my wrists as the heavy doors of the longhouse crash open. Smoke swirls in, thick with the burning fields' stench blood and ash mingling in the night air. I hear the guttural laughter of men, drunk on victory, dragging the fallen toward the fire. But it's not warriors they name. No, the chieftain's voice rings out, cold and deliberate, calling for the women, wives, daughters, widows, all taken as trophies of conquest. I've seen how they are chosen not for mercy, but for memory, not for love, but for domination. These women are trophies, bound in chains and dragged into the darkness of Viking life. Some are forced into beds still warm with their husband's blood. Others are marched toward ships, marked as offerings to distant gods, or as human currency for foreign markets. I have heard their screams swallowed by the sea, as if even the waves feared to remember them. This is the true, merciless face of the Vikings, unflinching, brutal, and absolute. But not all of their victims were forgotten. Stay with me, and you'll hear the stories that history tried to bury. Booscribe, now to discover what no one dares to speak about. The screams always come after the fire. You learn that quickly. When the longships strike the shore, the sound is not of thunder, but of men shouting in tongues older than your gods. They come through smoke and salt, axes glinting red, their faces painted with ash. Behind them, the world you knew burns. The houses, the livestock, the faces of those you loved, all vanish beneath the roar of flame and laughter. The first to die are the ones who run, the ones who stay are taken. I remember the moment the taking began, not a battle, but a sorting. The warriors walked among the fallen, choosing who would live. They lifted chins with the edges of their blades, measuring fear like traders at a market. Some women were struck down where they knelt, too old or too broken to be worth carrying. The rest were bound, together with rope still slick from the sea, wrists tied so tight the blood drained from their hands. We were not captives then, not yet. We were trophies, breathing proof of conquest. As the smoke thickened, they led us toward the shore where the longships waited, black hulls biting into the sand like beasts. The air stank of iron and wet wool. I saw one woman try to run a young one, barefoot, her hair matted with blood. She made it as far as the tide before they caught her. They didn't kill her. Death would have been a kindness. Instead, they tied her to the mast so that every oarsman could see her when the sun rose. That was the warning. That was the lesson. When night fell, the waves turned red with reflection from the fires on shore. We sat in silence, hands bound, mouths dry, listening to the crack of whips and the laughter of men who had taken everything. Some whispered prayers in the language of the dead. Others stared at the horizon, knowing they would never see their homeland again. The ships rocked gently, like cradles built for ghosts. By dawn, the coast was gone. Only the creak of the oars and the hiss of the sea remained. One of the men spoke of markets far to the east, where pale women fetched a higher price. Another laughed and said some were too beautiful to sell. The others nodded, their eyes lingering on the line of captives as if already deciding. I looked down at the sea and saw my reflection trembling beneath the surface, salt-streaked, bruised, and unrecognizable. That was the first truth I learned. In Viking hands, life was not spared, it was repurposed. The taking of the living was not mercy, it was possession, and once they claimed you, the gods themselves could not return what was lost. The longships cut through the grey sea like blades through flesh. Every oar pulled us farther from the burning coast, every splash erasing another trace of who we had been. The men sang as they rowed a deep, guttural chant that rose with the wind and fell with the waves. To them, this was victory. To us, it was the sound of being unmade. The smoke from our village still clung to their hair and cloaks, and the blood on their hands had dried into something almost ceremonial. They spoke of gods who rewarded slaughter, of honor measured in the screams of the conquered. When the sun climbed, they began to divide the spoils. Chests of silver were opened, blades exchanged, and laughter rolled like thunder between the ships. Then their eyes turned to us. We were made to stand, still bound, as each man made his claim. There were no words of love or promise, only numbers and nods, the quick math of ownership. Some men bartered women for weapons, others traded them for wine or horses waiting on the distant shore. The younger ones, barely old enough to grow beards, argued like boys over a game, boasting who would take first choice. One woman tried to spit at her captor. He struck her once, open-handed, as if silencing a child, and the others laughed. She fell to her knees but did not cry. That anger, that defiance, seemed to amuse them. They spoke to her softly then, their voices almost kind, as they discussed whether to keep her or pass her around. When she refused to rise, they cut her bonds and dragged her to the prow. The sea swallowed her screams before anyone else dared to speak. By nightfall, the ship smelled of salt, smoke, and sweat, the scent of men who believed themselves gods. The warriors feasted on dried fish and ale, while the captives huddled near the mast, cold and silent. One of them, an old woman with eyes the colour of fog, whispered that we had entered the afterlife already, that we were no longer among the living. She said the Valkyries had turned their faces away. I almost believed her. When the stars appeared, a man came to stand over me. His armour was dark with dried blood, his hair braided with bone. He did not speak. He simply placed his hand beneath my chin and turned my face toward the moonlight, studying me as if I were an animal he might buy or break. His eyes were calm, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. Then he smiled, not cruelly, but with certainty, and marked my arm with soot from the fire. That was his claim. I belonged to him now. As the night deepened, I realized the truth that every captive learns too late. The battle does not end when the swords are sheathed. It begins in the silence that follows when the victors start deciding what a human life is worth. By the time the ships reached their harbour, the world had already changed. The air smelled of pine and tar, and the mountains rose sharp and grey above the fjord. It was quiet there, too quiet for what had been done. The warriors dragged us from the decks, one by one, our feet sinking into the mud, our wrists rubbed raw from the ropes. The village that greeted us was alive with celebration. Drums beat from the longhouse, torches flickered along the shore, and free women came to welcome their men home with garlands of evergreen. They smiled at us as if we were ghosts, the spoils of a story they had heard many times before. The captives were brought before the Jarl, an old man with eyes pale as winter sky. He sat on a high chair, carved with dragons, a wolfskin draped across his shoulders. One by one, the warriors spoke their names, presenting their prizes. Each woman was declared property of the man who had taken her, and if he had fallen in battle, she passed to his brother or his friend. No one spoke of marriage, or love, or choice. The law here was simple. When a man's blood fed the ground, everything he owned, his home, his weapons, his wife, belonged to the one who spilled it. I watched as one warrior claimed the widow of the man he had slain. She stood silent, her face streaked with soot, her hands trembling as the Jarl pronounced her name beside her new master's. The people cheered as if it were a wedding. She did not look at him. She did not look at anyone. Later, when they led her to the longhouse, her veil caught in the doorframe. No one stopped to free it. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and mead. The warriors drank, boasting of raids and gods, while the women poured their cups. The captives served last, kept in a corner by the hearth. One of the older thralls whispered that this was the way of things, that a woman could rise again only through obedience. If you fight, she said, they will make you a warning. If you yield, they might let you live long enough to forget. I wanted to tell her that forgetting was worse, but I said nothing. That night, I saw the widow again. She sat beside the man who had killed her husband, her head bowed, her hands folded like a bride at prayer. He laughed and pressed his cup into her palms. smearing blood on her face when she refused to drink. Around them, the longhouse roared with song, but she heard none of it. Her eyes were fixed on the fire, the same fire that had taken her home. In the sagas, they call this the order of things. In truth, it was a trade of flesh for glory, of women for songs. When a man died bravely, his wife did not become free. She became the prize of his killer, the proof that he had lived as a warrior should. They brought us inland when the snows began. The fjords turned to glass beneath the moon, and the ships were hauled onto the frozen shore, their oars stacked like spears against the longhouse walls. By then, we had learned the rhythm of their world, when to kneel, when to speak, when to disappear into silence. The nights were long and bitter. Smoke coiled from the roof vents and drifted through the rafters like restless ghosts. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sweat, pine pitch, and animal hides. The chains were never far from the fire, their iron warm to the touch, ready for whoever forgot her place. They called us thralls. It was a word that tasted like rust. A thrall could be bought, sold, or broken without judgment. The law said she was worth half a man's life if killed, and less than a horse if crippled. The men who owned us wore those laws like armor. Some women bore it quietly, others did not. I remember one, the youngest among us, who refused to eat. She said she'd rather starve than serve. After 3 days, they tied her wrists with iron links and hung her by the rafters until her knees gave out. The Jarl's sons watched as she broke. By morning, she was still alive, but the defiance had left her eyes. The chains stayed on her wrists even when she slept. When they drank, the men liked to boast that iron kept a woman faithful. They said it pleased the gods to see obedience forged in pain. One of them told me that in Odin's hall, a captive who endured without crying would be reborn as a shield maiden. He said it like a blessing. I did not believe him, yet part of me wanted to, because believing that pain meant something was easier than knowing it did not. Some nights, they would unlock the chains, only to test our fear. They would drag a captive into the snow, strip her to her shift, and leave her kneeling beneath the northern lights while the men drank by the fire. The wind howled through the valley like a voice without mercy. I remember watching the sky turn green and white above her, the light rippling across her skin. When they brought her back inside, her lips were blue, her breath shallow, but she was still alive. That was their sport, to see how much life could survive their cruelty. In time, the chains became part of us. They clinked softly when we moved, a music of servitude that even sleep could not silence. I learned to walk without rattling them, to breathe shallow so the sound would not wake the men. The metal left scars that healed in the shape of circles, marks that would never fade, proof that we had belonged to someone once. They said iron was strength. But in those nights, it was only memory, the memory of freedom, bound in fire and silence. They gathered in the longhouse at dawn, when the air still bit like steel and frost clung to the eaves. The warriors sat shoulder to shoulder, their cloaks rimed with snow, their hands heavy with rings. On the floor between them knelt a widow, her hair undone, her wrists bound in wool rope. Her husband had fallen in the last raid, his chest split open on a Saxon spear. By every law of their gods, she no longer belonged to herself, her body, her home, even her grief. These were spoils now, subject to the will of men. The Jarl's lawman, grey-bearded and hollow-eyed, read from a strip of calfskin. His voice echoed off the beams, naming the rights of the victor. The man who slays another in battle shall inherit all that he owned, he said. And if that which he owned still breathes, it shall serve him, until the gods say otherwise. No one spoke. The widow stared at the fire pit, her face reflected in its coals. The man who had killed her husband stepped forward. His tunic was still stained with the dead man's blood. He said nothing, only reached down and cut her bindings. That was his acceptance. The law was satisfied. They say the gods smile upon a warrior who honors the old ways. But honor is a word that bleeds easily. That night, As the feast began, the widow sat beside her new master. He drank from her husband's cup, wore his cloak, and spoke his name as if testing how it fit upon his tongue. Each time the hall roared with laughter, she flinched. She tried once to leave, to slip into the cold before the watchmen lit their torches, but they caught her before the door. Her new master dragged her back by the hair, not in anger, but in ritual. "You will not wander," he said. "A wife does not follow the wind." By the next moon, her old name was forbidden. The runestone outside the longhouse bore her husband's name, carved deep beside a serpent coil. His memory was set in stone, but she was not. She was flesh to be rewritten, her grief turned into obedience, her mourning into labour. She served the mead at the feasts, tended the hearth, bore the lash when her eyes lingered too long on the door. The women told her to be still, to survive quietly. "Better a living thrall than a dead wife," they said. Once, in the silence after the men had slept, she whispered her husband's name into the ashes of the fire. The smoke curled upward, grey and fragile, vanishing through the vent like a spirit with no home to return to. She wept then, not for him, but for the cruel balance that had replaced love with law. Among the Vikings, death did not free a woman, it transferred her. The slain husband's honour became her chain, binding her to the man who took his life. The harbour at Hedeby was louder than any storm. Ships from every coast crowded the docks, their prows painted with dragons and beasts, their sails heavy with salt. The air reeked of tar, smoke, and sweat of lives, uprooted and carried here to be weighed, priced, and sold. I remember the sound most of all, the clatter of chains, the clamour of voices in a dozen tongues, the sharp cry of gulls circling above the trade of flesh. They herded us off the ship at dawn, half-starved, our feet swollen from the voyage. The guards prodded us forward with spear shafts, barking words we did not yet understand. Around us, merchants moved like priests in a holy rite. Some carried scales, others blades to mark the skin of new property. They examined teeth, lifted hair, traced fingers down arms and backs, assessing as though we were cattle brought to slaughter. A woman beside me, her face streaked with soot, asked what they would do with us. No one answered. At the heart of the market stood a long wooden platform, slick with seawater and old blood. That was where the bidding began. Men called out prices over the roar of the crowd arm rings, silver coins, bolts of dyed wool. A young girl fetched more than a warrior's sword, an older woman less than a dog. The merchants smiled as they bartered, their voices calm, their hands never trembling. It was a trade older than memory. When my turn came, a man with a scar across his nose pulled me up by the arm. He spoke my height and age aloud, as if reciting a curse. The bidders gathered close. One reached forward to touch my face. Another tugged at my hair and laughed. I did not fight. I had seen what happened to those who did. The scarred man raised his hand, and the bidding began. Coins clinked, rings changed hands, and in less than a minute, I had a new master. He was not cruel, at least, not at first. He gave me bread and water, even a cloak against the cold. But kindness in Hedeby was a form of ownership. It was not meant to heal, it was meant to make you forget. By night, I learned to listen for the sound of his boots on the floorboards, the slow rhythm that meant he was coming to claim what he had bought. The walls creaked like old trees as the wind pressed against them, but there was no wind inside, only the weight of his shadow. In time, I came to understand that Hedeby was not a place, but a promise, the promise that no soul was beyond price. Here, faith was traded for silver, freedom for comfort, dignity for survival. And those who survived long enough learned the only truth that mattered. In this world, even pain had a market value. The sea was black that night, a vast mirror reflecting no stars. The oars rose and fell in silence, their rhythm steady as a heartbeat. The ship carried no trade goods, no silver, no plunder. Its cargo was flesh women, taken from 3 villages along the coast, bound in wool and salt-stained ropes. We were not meant for market, we were meant for seed. The men aboard were hand-picked warriors, chosen by their Jarl for strength and lineage. They spoke little, except to drink or laugh about omens. One said that Odin smiled on ships that carried life instead of gold. Another said the gods favoured new blood, that even slaves could bear the sons of heroes if the sea accepted them first. The captain poured mead into the water, murmuring to Njord for calm seas and fertile wombs. The others laughed as the waves turned dark around the hull. Each night, they came down from the upper deck in pairs or alone. The torchlight made their shadows long and monstrous on the boards. They spoke to us as farmers speak to fields, not unkindly, but without seeing. When one of us screamed, the sound was swallowed by the wind. When one prayed, the others laughed. There was no choice, there was only endurance. Some women whispered that if they conceived, they would be kept alive longer, that the unborn might shield them from the axe. Others hoped the sea would take them first. One woman, pale-haired and silent, jumped from the stern on the 3rd night. The splash woke us all. The captain didn't stop the ship. He only said the sea had claimed its due. The next morning, her name was never spoken again. Her rope was reused for another. That was how it went. Weeks later, when land appeared, a jagged edge of green against grey sky, the ship grew quiet. The men rowed harder, their faces solemn. This was Norway's shore, cold and sharp as the iron they carried. Here, the women who lived would be divided among the farms, their worth measured by the seasons, and the children they worth with the pensions might bear. I heard one of them joke that the gods would smile upon the first to birth a son with blue eyes. When we disembarked, the air was heavy with pine and smoke. They led us to separate longhouses, where old women examined us as if we were brood mares, checking wrists, hips, teeth. They marked our arms with soot symbols, each one meaning fertile, barren, or unproven. No one asked our names, we no longer had any. That night, I lay on a bed of straw, listening to the sound of waves in the distance. I realized the sea was not freedom, it was the bridge between one kind of captivity and another. And somewhere in that darkness, a heartbeat echoed that was not my own. The first snow had already fallen when they brought us to the temple. Smoke rose from the sacred fires, curling into the pale sky like ghosts finding their way home. The air smelled of pine resin, iron, and fear. Around the stone altar stood the Jarls, the seers, and the men who now called themselves our masters. We were lined up in silence, each of us draped in rough wool and marked in soot. The mark meant belonging. The ritual would make it law. They called it a blessing Frelsen, the consecration of ownership. To them, it was holy, a promise between men and gods that no woman taken in battle would bring misfortune to her captor's house. But to us, it was the burial of who we had been. The seeress, an old woman with silver braids and eyes like frost, carried a bowl carved from the skull of a cow. Inside, blood and mead shimmered in the firelight. She dipped a branch of spruce into the mixture and flicked droplets across our faces. Each touch burned against the cold. "You are no longer daughters of the dead," she said. "You are seed for the living." One by one, we were presented to the altar. The man who claimed me pressed his palm against the back of my neck and made me kneel. The stones were slick beneath my knees. The seeress whispered a verse to the gods, to Odin for conquest, to Freyja for fertility, to Thor for strength. Then the man drew his knife. For a heartbeat, I thought he meant to kill me. But instead, he cut a thin line across his forearm and smeared his blood onto my brow. The seeress did the same, joining it with ash. "Bound by iron, sealed by blood," she said. "As long as she breathes, she carries your name." When it was over, the crowd cheered. The men lifted their drinking horns, toasting to new beginnings. I remember staring at the blood drying on my skin, feeling it stiffen like a brand. Around me, other women wept quietly, not from pain, but from the hollow knowledge that there was no undoing what had been done. Once the ritual was complete, there was no law in all of Norway or Denmark that could free us. To flee was to curse your master. To curse your master was to invite death. As night fell, they feasted beneath the temple's wooden beams. The flames painted the faces of the men gold, the faces of the captives red. Laughter echoed through the hall as songs rose for the gods who had blessed their dominion. I watched the seeress in the corner, her expression unreadable. When our eyes met, she gave a single nod, not of comfort, but of warning. Survive, her silence seemed to say. Even gods forget the names of those who do not. That night, the blood on my forehead dried into dust. I did not wipe it away. I wanted to remember the moment the world stopped being mine. Not all of them went quietly. Some learned to bow until the right moment came to strike. Among the thralls and war brides, there were women who remembered what freedom had felt like, who carried vengeance like a secret flame beneath their silence. They learned the words of their captors, learned which guards slept heavily, which doors never latched. In the long dark of the northern winter, they waited. One of them was called Yrsa, a woman from the east who had once been a farmer's wife before the raiders took her. Her hands still bore the calluses of the sickle, but her eyes had turned to steel. The man who owned her boasted that she was obedient, that she had accepted her place. He didn't notice the way she counted every knife, every ember in the hearth, every time his sons left the door unbarred. The night she vanished, she took 2 other women with her, one carrying a newborn, the other limping from an old wound. They disappeared into the pines, while the snow fell hard enough to cover their footprints. For 3 days, the men searched. They found nothing but the carcass of a reindeer half buried in frost and a strip of wool torn on a branch. The Jarl sent scouts to the mountain passes, but the women were gone. Some said they drowned crossing the river. Others whispered that the gods had hidden them. But a year later, when another raiding party went south, they found a burned longhouse on the edge of the fjord. Its roof collapsed, its men slain in their sleep. The chieftain's wife was missing, and carved into the doorpost was a single rune, Frelsey Freedom. There were others, too, who rebelled not with blades, but with cunning. Some mixed poisonous herbs into their master's ale, hiding the taste with honey. Some used the secrets they overheard in the longhouse to pit men against each other. A few bore children and taught them the tongues of their mothers, whispering old prayers when no one listened. These were acts of defiance, so small they might have seemed invisible, but in a world built on obedience, even silence could be rebellion. The sagas never tell their stories. They sing instead of kings and warriors, of gods who rewarded slaughter. The poets called the women shadows, as if they had no faces, no names. But I have seen their faces in the reflection of the hearthfire, in the glint of an axe before dawn. They were not shadows, they were ghosts that refused to fade. Years later, when the men of that fjord spoke of strange deaths of fires that began without reason, of cattle poisoned, of children born with the eyes of foreign women, they said it was a curse. They said the gods were angry. But I think it was something simpler. A reminder that even in chains, a woman could still strike fear into the hearts of men. The snow had not yet melted from the peaks when they came for her. She was the daughter of a fallen earl, captured in battle, her wrists still bruised from the ropes that had dragged her north. The chieftain who took her was older than her father, would have been but rich in land and silver. He claimed her not as a thrall, but as a bride, to seal the victory his sword had won. The difference, she soon learned, was only in name. They dressed her in wool dyed with woad and gold thread stolen from monks, a gown finer than anything she had worn before. The women of the household braided her hair, humming songs of the gods as if this were a celebration. But beneath their hands, she could feel their pity. When the ceremony began, she stood beside the hearth as the chieftain's seer pressed a ring of hammered iron into her palm, the bond of a wife. His blood was mixed with ale and poured over her hands while the guests cheered. "She joins our house," the seer declared, "and her womb joins our future." The feast that followed lasted 3 days. The men drank until their laughter blurred into growls, until even the dogs beneath the tables fought over bones. The chieftain sat at the head of the hall, his new bride beside him, her eyes fixed on the smoke swirling through the rafters. He lifted her chin once, as if inspecting his prize, and whispered that she would bring strength to his bloodline. When she didn't answer, he smiled a patient, knowing smile, and returned to his cup. That night, the longhouse grew quiet, but for the wind and the groan of the timbers. She was led to the upper chamber, to a bed lined with furs from his hunts. The smell of mead and sweat filled the room. She lay still as he approached, her body rigid, her hands hidden beneath the covers. He mistook her stillness for submission. It was not. When dawn came, the servants found her sitting by the hearth, her gown torn, her face empty. The chieftain slept beside her, blood drying, black along his neck. No one spoke of what had happened. The seer called it an accident of passion, a death blessed by the gods. The bride was not punished. Instead, she was declared his rightful widow, inheriting his lands and silver as the law allowed. Some said she had avenged herself. Others said she had simply become what the world made her, a survivor in a house of wolves. In the winters that followed, she ruled his lands with a silence that frightened men. No one dared touch her again. When raiders came, she met them at the gate, her husband's sword across her lap. Some whispered she had made herself a legend. Others said she was a curse made flesh. They called her the chieftain's bride, but in truth, she had married no man, only survival itself. They said she struck him with a hearth poker. The iron left a dark bloom across his temple, and he fell before he could draw his knife. It happened so quickly that for a moment the longhouse stood in silence, the fire crackling like it hadn't seen what had just occurred. Then came the shouting. Her name was Runa, a slave taken from the Irish coast 2 winters before. Her master had been known for cruelty, the kind that wasn't done in rage, but in boredom. He kept her near the hearth like a pet, fed her scraps when he was pleased, and cuffed her when he wasn't. That night, he'd been drinking with his kin, boasting of raids and sons yet unborn. When she spilled his ale, he rose with the same easy malice he always carried. But this time, she didn't cower. The iron poker swung in her hand before she even realized she'd moved. By dawn, she was dragged before the Jarl's council. Her hair was matted with soot, her wrists bound with twine. The man she'd struck lay dead in the snow outside, his body already stiff. The council chamber smelled of pine resin and judgment. The Jarl sat with his wolfskin cloak drawn tight, watching her with something like curiosity. A thrall who kills her master, he said, kills herself as well. His words hung in the air like frost. But Runa didn't beg. She looked him in the eye and said he was no god. Those 4 words rippled through the hall like a spark in dry grass. The men murmured among themselves. Some laughed, others frowned. A slave was not supposed to speak of gods, much less defy them. The punishment was swift. She was taken to the stone ring on the edge of the village, the place where oaths were sworn and blood was spilled to make them binding. They tied her to the central post and stripped her cloak away so the wind could find her skin. The Jarl pronounced her sentence, death by exposure, a slow offering to the gods she had insulted. The people gathered, not out of hatred, but curiosity. They wanted to see if she would scream. She did not. Snow fell through her hair, melting on her lips. For hours she stood unmoving, her eyes fixed on the mountains. When the sun dipped low, one of the Jarl's wives came forward, threw her own cloak over Runa's shoulders, and walked away without a word. By morning, the post was empty. The ropes lay loose in the snow, and no one ever found her body. Some said wolves took her, others whispered she'd been freed by the gods she refused to fear. That spring, when the Jarl's cattle died without reason and storms tore his roofs apart, the people said her spirit had returned, not as a curse, but as a reminder that even in chains, defiance has a price, and it is always paid in full. The midwives came before dawn, carrying linen and warm ale. Their faces were expressionless, their hands already stained from a lifetime of such work. The longhouse was quiet, except for the sound of breathing, hers, uneven and sharp, and his, calm as he dozed beside the fire. She was his thrall, taken from a monastery raid the year before, and now she bore his child. It wasn't the first time such a birth had happened here. The old women knew the pattern well. They said the gods chose which wombs would carry new blood into the clan, and no one dared question it. Yet everyone knew what it meant, the merging of conqueror and conquered, of pride and shame sealed in flesh. When the child was born, its cry filled the rafters like a broken horn. Pale skin, dark hair, neither holy one nor the other. The midwives exchanged a look, then turned away. The man woke and asked to see it. When they handed him the child, he studied it for a long time, as if the gods themselves might whisper what to do. Then he nodded once and said, "It will live." Those words decided everything. The baby was wrapped in fur, marked with ash, and placed at the foot of his bed, a sign that it belonged to him, but not entirely to the clan. The mother wasn't so fortunate. She was weak from the birth, her body trembling as she tried to rise. He told her she had done well, then left her to bleed alone on the straw. When she asked to hold the child, the women refused. "You are his vessel," one said softly. "Your work is done." By the next morning she was gone. Some said fever took her, others said she walked into the forest herself. No one searched. The child was raised in the chieftain's hall among the other fosterlings' children, of raids and broken vows, living proof of victory. They were fed, clothed, and taught to forget. When they were old enough, they were told that loyalty would make them kin. But no amount of loyalty could erase the silence that followed them, wherever they went. Years later, when the boy came of age, he asked about his mother. The hall fell quiet. The chieftain told him only that she had returned to the sea. The boy accepted it with a nod, though his eyes stayed fixed on the fire, watching how it devoured everything it touched. He became a fierce warrior, loyal to his father's clan, yet something restless burned in him. Before his first raid, he carved a rune into his blade, one the seers didn't recognize. They asked what it meant. He said it was her name. Among the Vikings, lineage was sacred, but not always pure. Bloodlines were forged in conquest, mixed in silence, and carried forward by those who never chose to be born. The frost never left the ground that season. Even the fjord froze in silence, its surface gleaming like hammered steel beneath a sun that offered no warmth. The men said it was a good omen that the gods favored stillness before trade. That was how winter auctions began in the north, when the ground was too hard to bury the dead but perfect for business. They came from every settlement within 100 miles, traders, farmers, and hunters, wrapped in furs, driving sleds heavy with goods. The longhouse at the center of the market was stripped of benches, its floor cleared for display. Iron lanterns swung from the beams, their smoke drifting in pale ribbons. The captives were lined up along the far wall, barefoot, dressed in thin wool, each one branded with soot or ink to mark her owner. The marks looked like protection runes, but they weren't. They were ledgers, a shorthand of price and possession. The auctioneer's voice rose above the murmuring crowd, naming each woman's origin like it was a title. One from the south, two from the islands, one from the priest's house. He spoke as if selling fine cloth, not human lives. Each time a hand lifted, a deal was struck with the clang of iron, a bracelet tossed to the table, a knife, a pouch of silver. No one looked at the women's faces. They were property changing hands, their worth determined by strength, youth, and silence. One woman refused to stand when they called her name. Her legs trembled, but she stayed on her knees, eyes fixed on the floor. The auctioneer struck her with a switch of birch and told her she would fetch less if she acted wild. She didn't move. It took 3 men to drag her forward. When the bidding began, No one spoke. A few men turned away, muttering about bad omens. Finally, an older trader from Hedeby stepped forward, offered a single silver coin, and took her without ceremony. As they led her away, she whispered something in a language no one understood. The trader didn't ask what it meant. By dusk, the hall was empty, except for the straw and blood left behind. The unsold women were given to the gods bound, carried to the edge of the ice, and left beneath the aurora. Some said their spirits went north with the lights, joining the ancestors in a place where chains couldn't reach. Others said their souls froze mid-breath, trapped forever between earth and sky. When spring came, the ice broke, carrying away whatever remained. The traders returned to their ships, their profits tied in sacks, their consciences lighter than their loads. And in the sagas they told that year, no one mentioned the auction, only the good harvest that followed, and the gods who had blessed them with calm seas. That is how memory worked in the north. The living traded, the dead were forgotten, and the silence between them was called order. There were mornings when the longhouse stirred before dawn, when even the ravens were still, and the only sounds came from the thralls. The creak of water buckets, the whisper of brooms over dirt, the soft grunt of women lifting wood heavier than themselves. Those sounds were the rhythm of captivity, a steady pulse beneath the roaring life of the free. The masters never heard it. To them, silence meant obedience. But within that hush, the thralls spoke to one another, in glances, in gestures, in the small mercies passed hand to hand when no one watched. A scrap of bread, a stitch of wool for a frozen wrist, a single word in a forbidden tongue. The overseer called it idleness when he caught them whispering, and punished them with the lash. He didn't know that silence was their rebellion, that every unspoken thought was a seed waiting for spring. Among the women, there was one called Aslaug, though no one knew if it was her real name. She had been there the longest. Her hands were thick with scars, her back bent from years of grinding grain and hauling water, but her eyes were alive, not defiant, just watchful, as if she remembered something the rest had forgotten. She was the one who taught the new captives how to move without sound, how to breathe shallow when the men were near, how to swallow rage like bread so it could feed you instead of kill you. Once, when the Jarl's wife caught her humming an old hymn while scrubbing the floor, she struck Aslaug across the face. The old woman didn't flinch. "Do not sing of your gods here," the mistress hissed. Aslaug bowed her head, but that night she hummed the same tune again, softer under her breath. The others joined her, one by one, until the longhouse seemed to hum like a living thing. It wasn't freedom, it wasn't defiance that would save them. It was something quieter, older endurance. They had no weapons, no armies, no names that carried power. But they had memory, and memory was sharper than steel. In the darkest part of winter, when the men were gone raiding and the nights stretched endless, Aslaug told stories by the hearth not of escape, but of patience. "The ice always cracks," she would whisper. "You just have to live long enough to hear it." The younger ones listened, their faces lit by the flicker of the fire, clutching her words like charms against despair. Years later, when spring came and the snows melted from the roofs, Aslaug's body was found beside the river. Her eyes were closed, her hands folded neatly across her chest, a faint smile on her lips. Some said she had walked there at dawn and laid herself down. The women buried her beneath a cairn of stones, and when the wind passed over it, it made a sound like distant humming. That was the last song of the thralls, soft, steady, and unbroken. The stories men told of shield maidens were made of glory of women who fought beside their lovers, who bled with honor, who died with their hands wrapped around a blade. But those were songs written by men who had never seen what came after the shield wall fell. The truth was quieter, crueler, and seldom sung. When the shield maidens lost a battle, they were not granted the same death as the warriors they fought beside. The men were burned on pyres, their swords placed across their chests. The women, if they were still breathing, were taken as prizes, reminders that even those who dared to fight could still be tamed. I remember one, called Brynhild, who had led the line when our village burned. Her hair was the color of ash, her eyes sharp enough to wound. She had cut down 3 men before they dragged her from the field, her hands bound behind her back with her own braid. They brought her to the camp like a trophy, her face streaked with blood, her jaw unbroken even after the blows. The men laughed as they stripped her of her armor, holding it high like spoils. "A shield without a sword," they said, "is just a woman again." That night, she sat by the fire while they argued over her fate. Some wanted to sell her to the traders at Birka, others wanted to keep her as a concubine for the Jarl's son. But Brynhild said nothing. Her silence unsettled them more than curses would have. One man younger than the rest, still with the softness of boyhood on his face, asked her if she regretted fighting. She looked at him for a long moment and said, "Only that I stopped too soon." Before dawn, she was gone. Her chains lay in the ashes, and her footprints led toward the cliffs. They searched the shoreline for days, but found nothing except her cloak, snagged on a rock near the edge. The Jarl's men said she had thrown herself to the sea, denying them their prize. The others whispered that the Valkyries had come for her, lifting her from the waves before. The dawn could claim her body. Whatever the truth, her name became a warning. When other women were caught with blades, they were branded with the rune for betrayal. To take up arms after Brynhild was to invite ruin. The skalds still sang of shield maidens, but only the ones who died obediently, on the battlefield, not those who defied their fate. Yet the old women kept her story alive, told in the dark while the men were away of the warrior who would not kneel, who left the world on her own terms. And when storms rose without warning, when the sea turned white with fury, they said it was her spirit riding the wind, reminding them that even in defeat she had never been conquered. They brought the foreign priests in chains, their crosses still hanging from their necks. To the Vikings, the symbol was strange, a man nailed to wood, a god who bled instead of conquering. They called it the Wolf Cross, believing it held some dark magic that weakened men's courage. When raids reached the Christian lands, women who wore it were taken alive. They were said to be cursed, and curses, in the north, were valuable things. Those women were treated differently. Some were kept as tokens, proof that their captors had defeated foreign gods. Others were used in rituals, their crosses melted down into talismans mixed with silver and blood. The seeresses said such charms made a man invisible to his enemies, that a bit of holy metal from a foreign woman's neck could confuse the eyes of Christian angels. One such woman, the men called Edda, though it was not her name. She was taken from a monastery on the coast, her hands once used for prayer now bound to the oars of a longship. When they reached Norway, her cross was torn away and hung over the doorway of the longhouse, nailed there as a trophy. The Jarl's wife said it would keep out spirits, the irony lost on all of them. Edda refused to renounce her god. Every morning she whispered prayers under her breath while carrying water, tracing invisible signs on her chest. The Jarl's men mocked her, calling her Wolf Witch, and warned that her words would sour the mead, but she kept praying. After the second moon, the cattle sickened. After the third, the Jarl's infant daughter died in her sleep. The people began to whisper. The seer was summoned to cleanse the hall. She burned juniper, drew runes on the doorframe, and said the sickness would not lift until the wolf cross was fed with blood. That night, they dragged Edda outside beneath the aurora. The wind howled across the snow as they tied her to the standing stone. "If your god is strong," the Jarl said, "he will come for you." She did not cry nor beg. She only said, "He already has." When morning came, her body was gone. The ropes still hung loose, frozen stiff, but there were no tracks in the snow. The Jarl ordered the stone broken and the cross thrown into the sea. Yet for years afterward, men swore that when the northern lights blazed red, they could see her face among them, pale, calm, and watching. The Jarl's wife wore a new amulet, after that a small cross, carved from bone, hidden beneath her furs. No one spoke of it, but all noticed the sickness never returned. In time, Even the Skalds came to fear the sign of the wolf cross, not because it was foreign, but because it had survived. Winter hid many sins in the north. When the snows fell heavy and the seas froze shut, the longhouses became small worlds of their own, sealed from judgment, sealed from mercy. That was when the births happened, quietly, without celebration or prayer. No horns, no naming feasts, no gifts left for the Norns. Only the sound of women breathing through pain and the faint cry of life entering a world that did not want to remember it. The children born to thralls and their masters were both everything and nothing. The men boasted of them when drunk proof of strength, of seed that could take root in any soil, but come morning they looked away. The mothers were forbidden to speak of the fathers, even when the resemblance was too clear to deny. Some babies were left at the edge of the forest, offered to the gods of frost and carrion. Others were raised in the shadows of the longhouse, growing up alongside the livestock they helped tend. One winter, a thrall named Inga gave birth to a child whose hair was pale as bone, eyes the colour of the sea. The Jarl knew the truth before anyone spoke it. He ordered the child hidden until spring, when the ground thawed enough for burial. But the midwife, an old woman who had seen too many silences swallowed by snow, refused. She wrapped the infant in furs and carried it to the cliffs, whispering prayers in both tongues, one for Odin, one for the god she'd once heard of from captives long dead. The child lived. Years later, that same child was seen among the traders in Hedeby, tall and strong, wearing a silver ring carved with two symbols, a hammer and a cross. No one knew how he had survived, only that he never spoke of his mother or his birth. Some said he carried both blessings and curses in his blood, but not all were spared. In most villages, unwanted births vanished like melting frost. A woman who bore too many children from her master risked her life. The Jarl's wives watched with cold eyes, knowing each new face might threaten their own bloodlines. Sometimes, a baby was found floating in a basket downriver, wrapped in cloth, marked with runes for forgiveness. Other times, nothing was found at all. The snow kept its secrets well. The sagas do not speak of these children. They name the kings, the warriors, the sons of noble houses, never the ones born in shadow. Yet, without them, the north would have been emptier. Their blood flowed quietly through generations, binding conqueror and captive tighter than either would ever admit. In the end, it was not the swords or the gods that changed the north. It was the births no one spoke of, the forgotten cries in winter, the children who grew up between two worlds, carrying both the shame and the strength of those who survived. They came from the lands of the cross-quiet villages that smelled of bread and incense, not blood and salt. When the longships arrived, their bells rang out, and the raiders thought it a war cry. But those bells were warnings no one heeded in time. The monks fell first, then the men. The women were taken while the smoke still rose from the altars. They were not warriors, nor thralls by birth. They were strangers who believed that mercy was a kind of shield. The Vikings taught them how thin mercy was against an axe. The captives were valuable, exotic, pale, soft-spoken, untouched by the cold ways of the north. Traders paid double for women who could read or sing hymns. Their voices were rare music in a world of roaring. Those who refused to serve were mocked for praying to a god who had allowed them to be taken. The warriors made them kneel before the idols of Odin and Freya, forcing them to pour mead over carved wooden faces while the hall laughed. Some complied, others spat in the bowl and took the blows that followed. One of them, a nun from Lindisfarne, was brought to the household of a sea king near Trondheim. She spoke little, her hair shorn close, her eyes like stone. They named her Marta, though she gave them no name of her own. Each day, she was made to clean the blood from the weapons, to polish the idols, to serve ale at the feasts. Each night, she whispered psalms in Latin, words none around her could understand. The Jarl's wife claimed her presence brought storms. The seeress claimed it brought the attention of foreign gods. In the third winter, when sickness struck the settlement, it was Marta who tended the dying. She washed their faces, prayed over their fevered bodies, and wrapped them in linen before burial. When the Jarl's son recovered after she laid a cross-shaped band of ash on his brow, they called it witchcraft. The seeress demanded she be cast into the sea, but the Jarl refused. "If her god can heal," he said, "then let him stay, in my hall." From that day, no one struck her again. When she walked through the village, people whispered not insults now, but prayers in broken fragments of her tongue. She had become something neither pagan nor Christian, a bridge between faiths born of necessity, not belief. Years later, when traders from the south came bearing silk and stories, they spoke of a woman who built a chapel on a fjord, its stones carved with both crosses and runes. They said she never married, never left the coast, and when she died, the sea was calm for 7 days. The North never truly converted by sword or sermon. It was won by captives like her women, who brought their gods with them in silence, until the silence became stronger than fear. When the wars dragged on, and victories turned to stalemates, peace had to be bought in flesh. The Jarls called it marriage, a joining of bloodlines, to seal oaths, end raids, and make enemies kin. But no feast, no song could hide what these weddings truly were: the binding of captives to their conquerors beneath the eyes of gods who demanded balance for every drop of spilled blood. The ceremony began at dusk, when the sky bruised purple and the torches burned low. The bride was washed in ice water, drawn from the fjord, her hair combed with a bone pick until it shone. The attendants told her the chill would purify her, that the gods preferred their offerings clean. She was dressed in wool-dyed red, not for beauty, but to remind her what had been taken. Around her neck they hung iron keys, the symbol of her new household, though every door they opened led to someone else's freedom. Her husband arrived from the battlefield, still wearing his sword. He greeted the Jarls, offered silver to her father's killer, and laughed when someone asked if he loved her. Love was not the purpose. The purpose was order peace through possession. When the seeress spoke the blessing, she poured mead over the couple's joined hands, the liquid dark and thick as blood. "May your union bring strength to the clan," she said. The crowd roared approval, drunk on mead and superstition. That night, the hall feasted as if the world had been reborn. Skalds sang of unity, while the bride sat unmoving beside her new husband, her gaze fixed on the fire. Every so often, he would place his hand over hers, not tenderly, but to remind her that she was there to be seen. When the guests began to fade into laughter and sleep, he led her away. The others pretended not to hear when the door closed. By morning, she was pale but composed, her expression carved from something colder than fear. The seeress placed a wreath of rowan on her head to protect her womb, they said. The men slapped. The groom's back, congratulating him for binding the peace. Outside, the captives from her old village hauled water and chopped wood, careful not to meet her eyes. Weeks passed, and the fighting stopped. Trade began again. The Jarls called it a victory of diplomacy, a triumph of custom. The bride was seen walking by the shore each night, barefoot, humming to herself in a language no one recognized. Some said she was calling to her ancestors. Others said she was teaching her unborn child the names of both sides. When spring came, the sea rose higher than anyone could remember, swallowing the dock and half the market. The old women whispered that the bride had kept her oath, she had brought peace, but the sea had taken its share. There was a place beneath the longhouse where no light reached, a crawl space of damp earth and timber beams blackened by years of smoke. Few ever entered it willingly. It was said that the ground there was cursed, fed with the secrets of the house. When a new woman was taken as a concubine or slave, she was brought there at night to make her oath. Not of loyalty that was expected, but of silence. The ritual was old, older than the sagas remembered. The seeress said it bound the spirits of the household together, so that no voice within could betray what happened behind its walls. A lie wrapped in the language of the gods. The truth was simpler. Men feared the tongues of women more than the swords of enemies, and so they buried those tongues in ritual and threat, year after year, body after body. The captives were led down by torchlight, the walls dripping with condensation, the air thick with the smell of mold and iron. They knelt in a circle etched with runes, their wrists bound with leather. Above, the floorboards groaned as the men drank, laughed, and sang the sound of life going on without them. The seeress would kneel too, her fingers red with ochre, and smear lines across their throats. "Speak not of what you see, nor of what is done to you," she would chant. "The house hears, the house remembers." One woman refused. Her name was Thora, and she had been the wife of a farmer slain in a raid. When the seeress reached for her, she turned her head away and said she would not bow to another god. The others gasped. The seeress's hand froze mid-air. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the Jarl himself descended the steps. His eyes were calm, his voice low. "You will kneel," he said, "or you will be the oath." They buried her beneath the floorboards that night. The sound of digging was masked by the storm outside. When they finished, they poured ale into the soil to seal the pact. No one spoke her name again, but every woman who took the oath afterward felt the cold rising from that same earth. Some swore they heard whispers when the torches died, a woman's voice, faint and steady, repeating the words, "I will not kneel." Years passed. The longhouse changed hands, its walls rebuilt, its roof patched again and again. Still, no one dared sleep directly above the old crawl space. Men claimed to hear breathing below them when they drank too much. Women, when alone, said they felt the ground tremble faintly beneath their knees. And so the oath endured not as silence, but as memory. The earth beneath the longhouse kept its promise better than any god. It remembered everything the living tried to forget. In every Viking settlement, there were women who did not belong to the living or the dead. They were the midwives called upon to usher souls both into the world and out of it. Their hands smelled of iron and smoke, their nails blackened from herbs and ash. The men treated them with wary respect, the way one might approach a wolf that had learned to speak. They were needed, but never trusted. When a captive woman fell ill, it was the midwives who came, carrying knives of bronze and bowls of boiled water. When a birth went wrong, it was they who cut the child free, whispering prayers to Freya and Hel alike. Yet their work stretched beyond the living. When death came, they prepared the bodies, combed the hair, washed away the blood, and wrapped the dead in linen. It was said they could see the line between breath and silence, and sometimes they chose which side a woman belonged to. Among them was a woman named Astrid, old as frost, her eyes filmed with milk. She had been both thrall and free, wife and widow, healer and executioner. The Jarls paid her in silver to tend their households, but they also feared her. It was whispered that she carried secrets in the folds of her cloak, herbs that could end a life as gently as sleep, runes that could call a soul back just long enough to speak. Astrid's hut stood beyond the fields, half buried in earth, its roof covered in moss. Women came to her when they could no longer bear the weight of survival, a thrall with a child she could not keep, a wife whose husband's cruelty had turned her faith to dust. Astrid never asked questions. She would pour a black draught into a horn and say, "Drink this, and the gods will not notice." Sometimes the women drank it themselves, sometimes they gave it to their masters in mead. Either way, the gods did not notice. When the men died, Astrid prepared their bodies for the pyres. She anointed them with oil, placed coins under their tongues, and whispered to them, as though they could hear. "You killed her in life," she would murmur. "Now she walks beside you in death." No one dared ask what she meant. One winter, a young girl from the slave pens was found in Astrid's hut, still breathing, but pale as snow. The Jarl's guards dragged her out, demanding to know what the midwife had done. Astrid only said, "She was dead already. I just made her remember." That night, the hut burned to the ground, but when they sifted through the ashes, no bones were found. In the spring, flowers grew where her hut had stood, white blooms shaped like tiny hands. The women whispered that Astrid had joined the ones she helped, tending to the dead as she had tended to the living, still standing between both worlds, where mercy was just another kind of defiance. When the harvest ended and the first frost rimmed the fields, the people of the north prepared for the blot, the winter sacrifice. It was meant to keep the gods fed through the long dark, to trade blood for favor. Cattle, horses, and sometimes slaves were offered, their throats cut beneath the moon. But among the captives, there was a whisper of a deeper rite, one not written in any saga, the ritual bath in blood. It began in the great halls of the Jarls, when victory was fresh and the spoils of war had been divided. A new captive young, unbroken, was chosen as a vessel of cleansing. They said the blood of the conquered carried power, that by bathing in it, warriors could wash away the curses of the dead and be born anew. The women selected for this rite were neither slaves nor brides, yet they existed in between, belonging to no one and therefore to everyone. On the night of the ritual, the fires burned low. The longhouse smelled of pine pitch, iron, and old smoke. The warriors stood in a circle, while the seeress stirred a great basin filled with warm blood, drawn from the animals slain that day, and sometimes, though no one admitted it, from those who would not survive the winter. The air was thick, metallic, almost sweet. The chosen woman was brought forward, stripped of all but a thin linen shift, her hair unbound and heavy with ash. She was made to kneel beside the basin, while the seeress murmured to Freya and Odin, invoking both love and death, for in their faith they were never far apart. Then the woman's hands were plunged into the basin. She was told to wash, to anoint her skin, to let the gods taste her fear. The warriors watched in silence as the blood spread across her arms, her chest, her face. Steam rose from her skin in the cold. If she cried out, they said the gods rejected her. If she was silent, they said she was blessed. The stronger ones learned to still their trembling, to hold the gods' gaze without flinching. When it was over, the seeress wiped her brow with a branch of spruce, marking her forehead with the sign of the Valknut, the knot of the slain. Then she was handed over to the man who had led the raid that year. That was the true purpose of the ritual, to cleanse her for use, to make ownership divine. By dawn, the blood had dried into her hair, flaking like rust. The basin was emptied into the snow, staining the ground where nothing grew for years afterward. And yet, when spring returned, the river that ran below the longhouse always ran red for a day. The people said it was the gods drinking their dew. The women knew better. Some stains never leave the earth, especially those made sacred by human hands. When kingdoms fell, treaties were sealed not with ink, but with daughters. They were sent north as living promises, hostages, dressed as brides. The Vikings called it Friðargjöf, the gift of peace. To the men who received them, it was a sign of power. To the women who went, it was exile with a smile. The daughters of kings, earls, and chieftains arrived on ships bearing silks and furs, their dowries measured in barrels of honey, amber, and gold. They were met at the shore by men who had burned their fathers' halls. Songs were sung to honor the alliance, yet every verse dripped with irony. These girls were praised for their beauty, for the grace with which they walked into captivity. No one called it by its name. One of them, Alfhild, was 17 when she was given to the man who had slain her brothers in battle. Her father called it diplomacy. Her mother wept into her hair and said nothing. When Alfhild stepped from the ship, her new husband greeted her with laughter, declaring before all that she was proof his sword had done the god's will. That night, she was taken to his bed, the union sanctified by mead and blood. By dawn, she was a wife in name and a prisoner in truth. Her duty was to bear sons, to prove that her father's blood could serve her husband's cause. When the first child came a girl, the house grew quiet. The second, a stillborn boy, was taken from her before she could see his face. The third lived, though pale and sickly, and the Jarl's kin whispered that the gods disapproved of mixing enemy blood. Her husband grew colder. She learned to speak his language, but not his love. Alfhild found her solace in the women's quarters, where the thralls worked the looms and whispered their stories. A woman from the Baltic coast, taught her the old spells of protection runes carved on driftwood, hidden beneath the bed to ward off cruelty. When her husband found them, he laughed and burned the wood before her eyes. But that winter, he fell ill after drinking from his own mead horn. He lingered for 3 days, his breath rattling like a drumbeat fading into snow. The people said it was fate, that Odin had called him home. Alfhild never denied it. She raised her daughter in silence, teaching her both the sagas of the north and the hymns of her homeland. The girl grew tall and sharp-eyed, her voice carrying the rhythm of 2 worlds. Years later, when she married, she chose a man of neither her mother's blood nor her father's. On her wedding night, she wore no veil, only a small silver pendant carved with 2 symbols, a cross and a hammer bound together. From that day forward, they said her line would never belong to one god or one people. It belonged to survival, the only true inheritance the daughters of enemies ever had. The markets of Miklagard, the city the Northmen called Byzantium, were a world away from the frost and pine of the homelands. The air there was heavy with spice and incense, the streets alive with the clang of bronze and the cry of merchants. It was said that the sun itself bowed lower over the city's domes, gilding even the filth in gold. For the women brought there in chains, the light was both dazzling and cruel. The Varangians' Viking mercenaries, who had traded their freedom for imperial coin, filled the city with northern voices. They came not only to fight, but to sell. Captive women fetched more in Byzantium than anywhere else in the known world. The Greeks admired pale hair and clear eyes, features rare in the south. The traders knew this and brought their cargo carefully guarded, washed and perfumed. They were not slaves of the field here, but luxuries, foreign curiosities, trophies to decorate the courts of emperors and merchants alike. A woman named Sigrun was among them. She had been captured in a raid along the Volga, sold 3 times before her feet ever touched the marble of Byzantium. Her captor boasted that she had the bearing of a queen, and for that she would fetch a nobleman's price. When she was led through the market, the crowds followed, calling her Russ woman, though she came from far beyond those lands. Her buyer was a soldier of the Varangian Guard, a man who spoke her tongue but not her pain. He treated her as one might treat a fine weapon, careful, but only because she was valuable. In his quarters overlooking the Bosphorus, she learned the sounds of the empire, bells that called to prayer, water that whispered against stone, and voices that sang of faith she did not know. He gave her silk to wear and wine to drink, yet never asked her name. When he marched with the emperor's army east, he left her behind with his coins and his absence. The city did not care. Byzantium swallowed lives as easily as the Persites' sea swallowed ships. So she sold the silks he'd left her, bribed a eunuch for papers, and vanished into the alleys near the harbour. There, she found others women who spoke her language in fragments, who bore the marks of the same trade. Together, they worked the docks at night, whispering to sailors about passage north. No one ever saw her leave, but years later, stories spread among traders on the Volga of a woman who guided escaped thralls across the steppe, her cloak lined with Byzantine gold thread. Some said she was Sigrun. Others said she was a ghost, the city's debt come calling. Byzantium never remembered the women it bought. Yet the north remembered the silver it paid coins that glimmered in longhouse firelight, each one carrying the echo of a name no one dared speak aloud. Among the many laws that ruled the north, none was more feared by captive women than the law of the iron collar. It was not written in runes or recorded in the sagas, but every thrall knew its meaning. Once the collar closed around your neck, you ceased to be a person. You were property, a living mark of shame forged in metal. The collar was not always iron. Some were bronze, some twisted copper, depending on what the owner could afford. But iron was the most common and the heaviest. A blacksmith would heat the band until it glowed, then hammer it shut while it was still warm enough to burn the skin. The ring wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to last. It bore small runes along its edge, the initials of its master, and a single word: Thrall Slave. They said the collar kept the gods from hearing a captive's prayers, that as long as it touched her skin, she was invisible to divine mercy. The seeresses claimed it prevented rebellion, that it bound the will as tightly as it bound the throat. But the truth was simpler. It made escape impossible. The collar could not be removed without breaking the metal or the neck beneath it. In one village near the fjord of Rogaland, there was a girl named Solveig who wore such a collar. She had been taken from Ireland when she was barely 15, sold twice before the Jarl bought her for his household. Her job was to tend the fires and wash the garments of the dead before their pyres were lit. The iron ring around her neck was dull from years of soot, but she had learned to keep it hidden under a scarf. One night, a storm swept in from the sea, tearing roofs from their beams. The lightning struck the blacksmith's forge and split it in two. Solveig saw her chance. While the men fought to save the boats, she crept inside the ruined forge, found a hammer half buried in ash, and struck the hinge of her collar again and again until her hands bled. When it finally cracked, the noise was so loud she thought it would summon the gods themselves. But no one came. She fled into the forest, collar still clutched in her hand. By morning, the Jarl's men followed her footprints to the edge of the cliff and stopped. The tracks ended there. Below, the sea churned white and endless. They searched for days, but found nothing. The Jarl ordered the iron collar kept above the hearth as a warning to others. Yet, strange things happened after that. The fires burned too hot, the dogs howled at night, and when the Jarl's wife entered the hall alone, she swore she heard a woman's voice behind her, whispering softly, as if reminding her that iron could break, and that silence, once shattered, echoes forever. The story of the stolen queen was one the skalds never sang in public halls, though everyone knew it. It was whispered instead over the crackle of hearth fires, in the quiet between storms, where truth and rumour blended like mead and blood. She had been a queen from the west, not of vast lands, but of fierce loyalty. Her husband, a minor king of the Celtic coast, had fallen when the longships came. They burned his hall and slew his guards, but spared her, for the Jarl who led the raid saw her beauty and declared that a woman who ruled men should serve him. The warriors cheered. The gods, they said, had sent her as reward. They brought her across the sea in chains of bronze, her crown melted down and reforged into an arm ring for her new master. In Norway, the Jarl displayed her before his court, calling her the treasure of kings. She stood tall despite the bruises, her silence heavier than any curse. The people admired her at first, for she carried herself like someone who still belonged to herself. But admiration turned to unease. A woman who would not bow was an omen. When the Jarl took her to his bed, she looked at him as if he were already dead. The next morning, his dogs refused to enter the hall. His favourite horse went lame. The seeress warned that the woman brought ill luck, that her foreign gods were angry. He laughed it off and told her to bless the queen with a ritual bath of goat's blood to bind her spirit to his household. But when the seeress raised the knife, the woman smiled. That night, the Jarl's men woke to the sound of the sea crashing louder than ever before. The longships had torn free from their moorings and drifted out into the fjord, vanishing into the mist. The next morning, the Jarl was found in his bed, eyes wide, lips blackened, his arm ring missing. The queen was gone. Some said she fled into the mountains with a slave who pitied her. Others swore she walked into the sea, her chains turning to serpents that carried her away. The seeress claimed she had returned to her gods, who struck the Jarl down for daring to own her. But the traders who sailed the western coast told another story. They spoke of a woman who commanded a ship painted black, her crew made of freed captives and deserters, her sails marked with a single rune Thralls, meaning free. Wherever she went, storms followed. Ships vanished. Whole harbours awoke to find their chains cut, their slaves gone. And each time, someone would find a single bronze ring nailed to a doorpost, inscribed with words few could read. The Queen remembers. The North had taken her crown, her husband, her name. But in return, she took their fear and turned it into legend. Long before the Christians came, the women of the North had their own priestesses, the voleurs, seeresses who spoke with gods, who read the future in smoke and bone. Men feared them as much as they revered them. Their words could raise a warband or doom a king. But when the age of raiding brought new lands, new gods, and new captives, the old ways began to darken. The voleurs were no longer protectors of the sacred. They became instruments of control. The Jarls began capturing holy women from conquered villages, druids, prophetesses, and healers, believing their power could be bound and made to serve new gods. They called them Kethubrithir, chained brides of prophecy. Some were forced to bless raids and births, others to chant over the bodies of the slain so their spirits would not haunt the men who killed them. They were kept apart from the thralls, watched day and night, their wrists marked with runes that meant seer and slave. One such woman was known as Fiala. She came from across the sea, from a land of standing stones and mist. The raiders who captured her said she spoke to crows, that she knew the day each man would die. When she was brought before the Jarl, she did not kneel. Instead, she looked at him with a quiet pity that unsettled the hall. "You will serve the gods of the North," he told her. "They will speak through you." She answered softly, "The gods you serve have stopped listening." He struck her for those words and ordered her chained to the great pillar of the hall. Each morning, she was made to predict the success of the next raid. When her prophecies failed, men accused her of cursing them. When they succeeded, they feared her even more. The Jarl's wife demanded she be silenced. No woman should command men's attention that way. So they took her voice, cutting her tongue, believing that without words her visions would die. But they didn't. That winter, every fire in the longhouse burned lower than it should. The crops rotted in storage. The Jarl's men drowned in calm water. The seeress's silence seemed to echo through the walls, a voice louder than speech. The people began to whisper that she had cursed the land. One night, the hall went dark. When dawn came, Fiala's chains lay empty. No door had opened, no guards had slept. Only the ravens remained, perched along the roof beams, their beaks stained with soot. The Jarl ordered the hall rebuilt and the pillar burned, but no one would touch it. The wood hissed like a living thing. Years later, travellers spoke of a woman wandering the northern shores, her wrists scarred, her eyes white as moonlight. Wherever she passed, storms followed not of wind or rain, but of memory. And men who saw her said she smiled, as if the silence she carried had finally become her god. In the north, a woman's worth was often measured by her sons. To bear one was to gain a fragile kind of safety. To bear none was to invite replacement. But for captives, women taken in war and given to men, they had no choice but to serve. That same fate became a weapon. The child in their womb was both protection and sentence, a life grown from violence that could never be fully claimed by either side. When a captive conceived, the household changed. The Jarl's wife would watch her closely, half in hatred, half in fear. If the child lived, its blood would blur the lines between lineage and shame. If it died, it might take the mother with it. The gods were said to favour strong wombs, yet even the strongest could not survive what the law demanded. The midwives were careful not to meet the mother's eyes. They knew that a woman who bore her master's son was too dangerous to pity. If the child thrived, the mother might be allowed to stay. If it was weak, she would vanish by the next moon, her name swallowed by the wind. Some said the Jarls sacrificed those women quietly, offering their blood to Freya for fertility. Others said they were sent away to die in the woods, their bodies left to the wolves so that no one would have to name the crime. There was one story, told in whispers, of a woman called Thea, a thrall who gave birth to twin boys in the dead of winter. Her master claimed them as his heirs, declaring that the gods had blessed his line. But when his wife saw the newborns, she noticed what the others feared to say aloud. One had his mother's dark eyes. The next morning, Thea and her children were gone. The official story said she fled. The truth was buried beneath the snow. Years later, travelers in the mountains spoke of a woman living alone near a frozen lake, her hut guarded by 2 wolves. They said she carried a child on her hip, though she never seemed to age. The Jarls dismissed it as superstition, yet none dared send men to verify it. Those who did never returned. The North had many laws, but none as cruel as the one that governed blood. A woman could give everything, her body, her voice, her strength, yet still be judged by what she carried inside her. A son could free her or damn her. A daughter could seal her fate. And so, when the longhouses filled with the sound of crying infants, the women knew to keep silent. They did not rejoice. They did not mourn. They simply waited to learn whether the gods, or the men who claimed to speak for them, had decided that their suffering would continue another generation. The sea was the only god that could not be tamed. It took as it pleased, returned what it wished, and listened to no prayer that came from dry land. Every spring, when the ice broke and the longships were fitted for raiding, the Northmen made their offerings to Njord, god of wind and waves. Animals were slaughtered, gold was thrown into the fjord, and sometimes, though never written in runes or spoken in public captives, were given to the water. They called it the sea's price. No man wanted to name it for what it was, but the women knew. The ones who were weakest, or newest, or simply unlucky, were taken from the pens the night before the fleet sailed. They were washed in cold salt water, dressed in linen, and crowned with seaweed. The men said it was to make them pure for the god who ruled the tides. In truth, it made them easier to forget. The ritual began before dawn. The air smelled of tar, brine, and pine smoke. The seeress would stand on the prow of the lead ship, her hair braided with shells, chanting to the waves. Njord, lord of wealth and calm seas, she would call, take what is yours, and leave us your favour. The captives were brought forward one by one, bound at the wrists, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the water met the sky. Some went quietly, as if already claimed by the sea. Others fought, and those were remembered. One woman, captured from the Frankish coast, broke free of her ropes and leapt into the water before the priestess could touch her. The men cursed, afraid the god would take offence, but the seeress only smiled. She chose her own offering, she said. Njord will be pleased. When the ships finally launched, the water behind them was red with dawn or with something else. The raiders rowed hard into the mist, believing themselves blessed, their hearts light with the illusion of divine favour. But back on shore, the waves turned strange. Nets came up empty for weeks. Fish washed ashore belly up, their very pieces, eyes clouded white. The villagers whispered that the god had grown weary of blood. By summer's end, a storm rose without warning. The sea devoured half the fleet and cast the wreckage back on the sand. Among the splintered timbers, the women's bones washed ashore, white and clean as driftwood. The seeress vanished soon after, her hut found empty except for a wreath of kelp hanging from the rafters. From then on, no one spoke of the sea's price. The new Jarls built stone altars for Njord and offered silver instead. But every spring, when the wind turned warm, the wives of sailors would wake from dreams of hands rising from the deep, pale, silent, and reaching as if the sea still remembered what it had been given. When a great man died in the north, his body was never sent to the next world alone. The dead required company, they said, loyal servants, fine weapons, animals, and women to serve him in the afterlife. The richer the man, the more lives were buried to prove his worth. The practice was older than the sagas, a remnant of a world where death was not an ending, but a continuation of ownership. The women chosen for this honour were called Fildukona, the following women. Some were wives, Others were thralls. None were volunteers. When the Jarl's pyre was raised on the hill, their fates were sealed. The seeress would declare that the gods had called them to accompany him to Valhalla, and the crowd would cheer, pretending not to see the fear on their faces. The ritual began the night before the burning. The women were given mead until their speech slurred and their bodies swayed. A feast was held around them, laughter, music, and the clatter of drinking horns. The dead man's kin toasted his glory, while the living sacrifices sat draped in silk, their wrists bound loosely with ribbons that would soon be replaced by rope. The eldest of the seeresses would lean close and whisper, "You will not feel it long. The fire is merciful." When dawn came, the longship prepared for the pyre was already waiting, filled with the Jarl's treasures, swords, shields, food, and beasts slaughtered for the journey. The women were led aboard and seated beside the corpse, dressed in their finest clothes, the smell of death mingling with the sweetness of herbs. One woman always sang a low, trembling chant that rose with the wind. It was said to guide the spirits. But when her voice cracked, the crowd knew she sang for herself. In some places, they were strangled before the flames were lit. In others, the pyre was their execution. The fire climbed quickly, feeding on tarred wood and oil, consuming flesh and silk alike. The onlookers shouted praise to Odin and Thor, their faces bright with reflected flame. "He does not travel alone," they cried. "He takes what is his." Once in Birka, a thrall named Hela managed to free her bonds as the pyre was set alight. She leapt from the ship into the fjord, her gown blazing like a second Sunday. The guards found only ashes and steam. The next morning, fishermen claimed to see a figure standing on the waves, her hair still smoking, her face turned toward the rising dawn. After that, the priests declared the gods satisfied and forbade further burnings. But in secret, the old custom lingered. When rich men died, their wives were found beside them, not burned, but strangled with silken cords, their faces untouched by flame. It was mercy, they said. And mercy, in the north, was only another name for obedience. Far to the west of the mainland, scattered along the grey edge of the sea, lay small islands where the unwanted were sent, the maimed, the mad, and the women who had outlived their use. The Northmen called them Brotnar-Ejar, the Isles of the Broken. To speak of them was to invite misfortune, yet every fjord had stories of someone who had vanished that way. The ships that sailed there carried no cargo and flew no banners. They left at dusk, when the fog was thick, their oars muffled with rags so the sound wouldn't follow back to shore. The passengers were always the same: thralls too scarred to sell, widows who had defied remarriage, priestesses who had seen too much, and children born of mixed blood the Jarls feared to claim. They were taken to the isles under the pretense of mercy, safe places, the seeresses said, where the gods might judge them quietly. The truth was colder. The islands were barren, treeless, lashed by wind. Turf huts sagged along the rocky slopes, and the ground grew nothing but lichen and saltweed. There were no guards, none were needed. The sea itself was the wall. The women learned to survive as best they could. They fished with bone hooks, gathered driftwood for fires, and trapped seabirds with nets woven from their own hair. They grew hard and lean, their faces wind-burned, their eyes turned forever toward the horizon. Some spoke to the sea, believing it the only god that still listened. Others forgot speech entirely. The oldest among them, those who had lived through many winters, became the island's memory, passing down stories of the lives they had lost. There was one, they said, who had once been a noblewoman, the widow of a warrior who died without sons. When the Jarl demanded she marry his cousin, she refused, declaring she would not bear another man's children. Her defiance was called madness, and she was sent to the Isles. But she did not die there. She became their leader. Under her, the women carved runes into the cliffs to mark the passing seasons. They fashioned crude spears from driftwood and bone, enough to keep the raiders who came hunting for slaves at bay. Some said they even built small boats from sealskin and tar, though no one ever saw them sail. In time, the stories changed from tragedy to warning. Fishermen swore that on stormy nights they saw fires burning on the islands, too many to count. Others claimed to hear women singing above the waves, their voices low and steady, like mourning turned into strength. By the time Christianity came to the north, no one remembered the real name of those islands. Maps called them cursed, unfit for travel. But the old women still whispered the truth that the Isles of the Broken were not a graveyard. They were a sanctuary built from the wreckage of the world's cruelty. They were not warriors, these men of the north, who called themselves merchants. They carried no shields, no banners, no songs of glory. Yet they were more feared than raiders. Their weapons were ledgers, their battlegrounds, the docks of Kaupang, Burka, and Hedeby. They dealt in fur, amber, wine, and flesh. The traders of flesh never dirtied their hands with blood. They let others do that. They only measured what blood was worth. Their stalls were always near the water, where the smell of salt and tar could hide the stench of captivity. Ships from the Baltic, the Rus, and even the distant caliphates brought their cargo to them. Men and women, young and strong, captured in raids or sold by desperate kin. The traders sorted them as a butcher might sort livestock by age, by strength, by beauty. The women fetched the highest prices, especially those with pale skin or foreign tongues. Exotic, they called them, as if the word softened what it meant. Records from travellers in the East spoke of it with strange detachment. They wrote that the Northmen sold women like fine goods, that the markets were orderly and fair. But there was nothing fair in the way a girl was forced to stand in the cold while strangers lifted her chin, examined her teeth, and bartered over her value in silver. The traders marked the sold with ink or scar, so they could never claim freedom later. A single rune cut above the collarbone, slave, slave. Some women tried to appeal to mercy, others to price. The traders listened to neither. Mercy did not pay for ships, only flesh did, and so women became coin that could buy sails, swords, or a seat at the Jarl's table. A young captive could fund an entire expedition, a beautiful one could ransom a war. Among the traders was a man named Ulfar, who prided himself on never killing. "I do not take lives," he said, "I move them." Yet his hands were never clean. Once, when a mother refused to leave her child, he ordered the boy sold separately. The woman cursed him, spitting in his face. Weeks later, his ship caught fire mid-sea. Survivors swore they saw her face in the flames, smiling. In time, Ulfar grew rich. His hall was lined with foreign rugs, his table with gold from the east. But he never slept soundly. The wind off the fjord brought whispers he could not ignore, voices speaking in a dozen tongues, rising with the tide. His servants said they saw footprints in the frost outside his door, small and bare, leading down toward the water. When Ulfar died, no one found his body. Only his scales remained balanced perfectly, empty on both sides. The sagas remembered the warriors, not the traders. Yet it was they who bound the world together in silver and sorrow, their fortune measured not in gold, but in the weight of the human soul. When a man died in the north, his widow was expected to mourn for a season, but never too long. Grief was a luxury for the young and the beautiful, not a right. The law said a widow's tears belonged to her husband's memory, but her body belonged to the clan. If she had no sons to claim her, the Jarl would assign her to another man. To refuse was to invite exile or death. Yet some refused anyway. Those women became ghosts long before they were buried. They called them Nagrind Konor Gate Widows, women who stood between life and death, unwanted by both. It was said their touch could sour milk, and their gaze could spoil crops. The men called it a curse, though the curse had been theirs to begin with. There was one such woman, whose name the skalds never spoke. Her husband had been a warrior, killed at sea when his ship capsized in a storm. His kin took her into their home, saying it was their duty, but the eldest brother soon claimed her as his own, citing custom. She refused. The next day, he accused her of witchcraft, saying her mourning had offended the gods. They dragged her before the seeress, demanding she be cleansed. The cleansing took place at dusk, near the stones where the dead were burned. She was stripped, bound, and washed in seawater, so cold it tore the breath from her lungs. The seeress painted runes across her chest not for purity, but for silence. The crowd watched as the widow bit through the rope around her wrist and spat salt into the Jarl's face. "You will forget my name," she said, "but you will remember what you did." Then she walked into the sea and did not return. That winter, the fjord froze earlier than ever before. Nets tore. Boats capsized in calm water. The Jarl's brother, who had claimed her, drowned one morning while cutting ice, his body found standing upright beneath the surface. The seeress said the widow's spirit had followed him, that she had become Hafkona, a woman of the deep. In the years that they followed, men began leaving offerings by the shore, bread, honey, and once a lock of hair to appease her. The fisherman said that if you saw her reflection in the water, it meant a storm was coming. Some even claimed that during the long winter nights, her voice could be heard beneath the ice, humming the same funeral song she had once sung for her husband. No priest, pagan or Christian, ever lifted her curse. Perhaps because it was never a curse at all. It was remembrance sharper than any blade, colder than the sea itself. A woman wronged had become the North's conscience. Her grief turned into something eternal, and so the men of that fjord learned to fear what they could not bury, a widow who refused to be forgotten. There were no lullabies for the children born without names. No runes carved for them, no feasts, no blessings. They were called Losunga, the looseborn, the fatherless, and their mothers carried the shame like frostbite, a wound that never thawed. In the north, a man's blood determined his worth, a woman's his downfall. The women who bore such children were not always slaves. Some were concubines promised freedom if they pleased their masters. Others were wives whose husbands had been gone too long at sea. A few were simply victims of the longhouse nights, when laughter turned to command, when silence was safer than defiance. When the belly began to swell, the whispers began too. If the father was powerful, the Jarl might acknowledge the child, giving it a token, a knife, a pendant, a small piece of legitimacy. But most were denied. "A bastard has no roots," the men said. "He grows crooked." And so the mothers were made to live apart, tending the herds or spinning wool in huts beyond the village walls. Their children followed, half fed, half seen, learning early that hunger was a form of language. One such woman, Brynja, had been taken from the Hebrides. Her child's father was a sea king who promised her a place beside him if she bore him a son. She did, but when she placed the infant in his arms, he saw her dark eyes in the child's face and turned away. "Too much of the mother," he said, and walked out into the snow. That night, Brynja left too, carrying her son in a sling against her chest, walking until her feet bled. They found her years later, living deep in the birch woods, the boy grown tall and quiet, his hair pale as bone. He called himself nobody's kin and spoke to no one but his mother. Traders who passed through swore that when they met his eyes, they felt as though the forest itself was watching them. The saga makers ignored such stories, for they did not fit the songs of glory. Yet the truth was simple. Bastards were everywhere. They served as warriors, smiths, poets, and sailors, men who owed loyalty to no house and carried no family's curse but their own. The priests who came later found them easier to convert, for they had been raised in exile and already knew what it meant to worship an absent father. As for the mothers, they became the midwives of survival. They knew how to make a meal from scraps, how to heal wounds with moss, how to teach a child to stand without help. In the long nights, they whispered to their sons, not of vengeance, but of endurance. And when those sons became men, they built their own halls not from inheritance, but from defiance. Each one a living rune, proof that shame could grow roots after all. Every 9th year, when the moon of winter swelled and the air froze like glass, the people of the north gathered at Uppsala, the great temple where gods and men traded promises sealed in blood. It was said the walls were plated with gold, though those who'd been inside whispered that the shine came from something darker, 1,000 layers of dried sacrifice glinting in the torchlight. The kings came first, leading their processions through the snow, followed by farmers, traders, and warriors. Each brought an offering: cattle, horses, and men taken in war. The captives were led in chains, their skin pale against the crimson banners fluttering in the wind. They were told they were chosen a word that almost sounded holy until the drums began. Women were seldom named among the offerings, but they were always there. The seeresses said that to honor Freya, goddess of fertility and desire, the blood of women must mingle with that of beasts. Some were slaves marked as barren, others wives accused of faithlessness. They were anointed with oil and wine, their hair combed with bone, their wrists tied with ribbons the color of rust. When the high priest raised his blade, the crowd fell silent. The blood ran into a great basin carved from a single stone, where it was mixed with ale and scattered on the worshippers. Life feeds life, the priest proclaimed, splattering faces, hair, mouths. The believers lifted their arms to the gods, while the captives were led behind the temple, where the earth was soft and red, and the snow never stayed white for long. One winter, it was said, a woman among the sacrifices spoke as the knife was raised. Her name was Ingrid, taken from a Christian village across the sea. "Your gods are hungry," she told the priest, "but they will never be full." They gagged her before she could say more, fearing her words might anger the idols. Yet when the knife fell, the sky cracked with thunder, though no storm had been seen that year. That night, fires broke out across the camp. Cattle panicked and trampled the fences, and by morning, the basin of blood had frozen solid black, not red. The people whispered that the gods had turned away. The next year, fewer came to offer sacrifices. The priests called it heresy. But the silence that followed was louder than prayer. By the time the Christians reached Uppsala, the old temple was nearly empty. They tore it down, built their church on its bones, and buried the basin beneath the altar. Yet, on cold nights, the priest said the ground still bled through the floorboards, and the air smelled faintly of iron. The blood feasts had ended, but the gods, it seemed, had never stopped feeding, only changed what they asked for. The North Sea was never still. Even on calm days, it seemed to breathe a restless god turning in its sleep. To the Vikings, it was both a path and a grave, swallowing men and ships alike. But it was the women who disappeared most quietly. No sagas named them, no songs recalled their loss. They were the ones taken aboard and never seen again, captives, wives, or servants who vanished somewhere between the shore and the horizon. Some said they were thrown overboard as offerings when storms rose without warning. Others claimed they slipped into the water by choice, preferring the sea to the longhouse. A few were simply erased, sold, traded, or buried at sea to hide the evidence of what had been done. The ocean made a perfect accomplice. It left no graves, no questions, only absence. Among the traders who sailed between Norway and the Orkneys, there was a tale told in low voices of a ship called Sea Spear. She was swift and well built, but cursed. Every voyage she carried women in her hold, bound for markets in the east. Every voyage, one woman vanished. No one ever saw her fall, and no one heard her scream. The captain said it was the sea claiming its due. The crew believed him until one winter night, when they saw a figure rise from the water beside the ship, pale, hair streaming like seaweed, eyes burning blue. The oarsmen froze where they Saturday. By morning, the captain was gone, and his cabin door hung open, soaked with salt. After that, the crew refused to sail her again. The ship drifted ashore weeks later, empty except for ropes still wet with seawater and a single woman's braid nailed to the mast. The locals burned the hull, but the fire hissed and spat as if something beneath it refused to die. There were quieter vanishings, too. Fishermen's wives who went down to the water and never returned. Thralls who followed their stolen children into the surf. Once, in the fjords near Stavanger, an entire family's women were taken by a wave that rose higher than the hall itself. The men said it was the wrath of Ran, goddess of the drowned, reclaiming her daughters. They left wreaths of kelp and bread by the shore, whispering apologies to the sea. The Christians later called these stories superstition, but they never could explain the lights, the pale, flickering orbs seen drifting just beneath the waves on moonless nights. Sailors said they were the souls of the lost, walking the seafloor toward home. Others said they were warnings. Even now, the North Sea keeps its dead close. Sometimes, after storms, bones wash ashore, polished smooth by centuries of tide. They look almost like shells, fragile, white, and hollow. When children find them, they hold them to their ears, listening to what they think is the ocean. But what they hear, the old women say, are the voices of those who vanished, still whispering beneath the waves. In the north, a slave who fled was not simply disobedient, she was a threat to the order of the world. Freedom, once seen, could spread like fire through the longhouses, burning the careful structure of ownership the Jarls had built. And so, when a thrall ran, her capture was not enough. She had to be made into a lesson. The punishments varied by land and lord. Some branded the runaways with hot iron, a mark burned between the shoulder blades, shaped like the rune for betrayal. Others took an eye, or clipped an ear, or cut the tendons behind the knees to keep her from running again. The seeresses called it justice. The men called it deterrence. The women called it what it was, terror. The worst sentence of all was running the gauntlet. The captive was made to sprint between two lines of her peers, slaves, wives, and concubines, each holding a stick or lash. If she reached the end alive, her life was spared. Few ever did. The others were forced to strike her, even those who had once shared her bed or whispered escape plans beside her in the dark. Refusal was its own crime. The Jarls knew that breaking a woman's body was easy. Breaking her faith in one another kept her silent forever. In one settlement along the fjords of Jutland, there was a thrall named Kayla who had tried to flee with her son. She made it as far as the marshes before the hounds found her. They dragged her back through the village by her hair, her child still clinging to her arm. The Jarl declared that the boy would live as long as he struck the first blow. The child's hand shook so badly the stick slipped from his fingers. Kayla looked at him and said, "Do it. Better by your hand than theirs." By dawn, she was dead. The boy survived, taken into the Jarl's household as a servant. Years later, when the Jarl died, the same boy grown now, silent and tall, refused to light the funeral pyre. Instead, he took his mother's bones from the midden where they'd been, thrown, wrapped them in linen, and buried them by the riverbank. No one stopped him. No one dared. From then on, strange things happened in that valley. Horses refused to cross the river. Fires burned low, no matter how much wood was piled on. The new Jarl said it was her spirit, angry and unburied, guarding the place where she'd fallen. The old women nodded. They began leaving bits of bread by the water, whispering her name under their breath. In time, no one tried to run from that settlement again. Not out of fear of punishment, but because they said Kayla still walked the marshes at night, watching, waiting, making sure no other woman would ever be hunted alone. When a great chieftain died, his body was laid in a ship carved from oak, its bow pointing toward the realm of the gods. The skalds sang, the torches burned, and his name was carried into eternity. But far from the songs and the gold, there were other ships, smaller, rougher, buried in silence, where the dead did not sail to glory, but to oblivion. These were the burial ships of the enslaved. No one spoke of them openly. They were not recorded in runes or honored in story. Yet the earth kept their memory. In bogs and dunes across the north, archaeologists would one day find them. Narrow boats buried in shallow pits, without weapons, jewelry, or offerings, only bones bound in twisted postures, wrists still shackled, skulls turned toward the sky. The ancients had buried their thralls beneath their masters to ensure loyalty even in death. In the time of the old Jarls, it was considered noble to take servants to the grave. When a lord died suddenly, his household would be gathered and questioned. One or two were chosen the strongest, the youngest, or the most beautiful. The seeress would declare them blessed, their blood needed to guide their master through the underworld. The others would sing as they were led to the burial mound, pretending it was an honor. But the songs always ended before the earth was filled. There was one burial that people still whispered about, the ship of Jarl Einar the Cruel. When he fell in battle, his men built a mound so vast that the whole valley was shadowed by it. 10 slaves were chosen to accompany him. 9 died quickly, strangled with silk cords and laid beside his corpse. The 10th, a woman called Mirren, was kept alive. She had been his concubine and his property. The seeress said her breath would carry him into the next life, so she was sealed in the chamber with him, still breathing when they closed the planks above her head. That night, the wind rose. The mound groaned as if something inside it still struggled. For 3 days, the storm raged. When it cleared, the villagers found the mound split open along the keel of the ship. The bodies inside were untouched, except for the Jarl's. His bones were scattered, his skull cracked, and the woman's chains lay broken beside him. Of Mirren herself, there was no trace. The seeress ordered the mound rebuilt, but the earth refused to settle. The soil sank again and again until the grave became a hollow, filled with stagnant water. The people began to call it the Slaves' Fjord. Fishermen avoided it, saying a woman's voice could be heard beneath the ripples, whispering in the old tongue, asking each passing boat the same question. Whose grave do you row over? No one ever answered. They simply rowed faster, because in the north, even the dead learned how to escape. There were women in the north who refused the chain, the collar, and the brand. When fate cornered them, when the ropes were tied, when the longhouse door shut behind them, they reached instead for the only freedom left, the blade. The sagas mention them rarely, and always in shame, for the old gods demanded endurance, not surrender. But among the women, their names were remembered as blessings spoken under breath, the ones who chose the blade rather than let others choose for them. A story survived of one such woman, called Alruna. She was a captive from the Baltic coast, brought to a small settlement near Trondheim. Her master took pride in breaking the wild ones, the women who still looked him in the eye after the first beating. But Alruna never bowed. She did his work, spoke when spoken to, and saved her silence for the nights when the wind rose through the gaps in the roof. In her 3rd winter, he decided she would become his concubine. The feast was already being prepared when she vanished from the longhouse. They found her hours later in the barn, sitting against a wooden post, her shift red at the throat, his S3X, the short knife he wore at his belt, lying beside her hand. She had cut deep, clean, and without hesitation. They said her eyes were still open, watching the rafters as though seeing the world from above. Her master ordered her buried without rites, her body burned on frozen ground. But when the fire was lit, it would not catch. The logs hissed and blackened, yet the flames refused her. The seeress declared that the gods had claimed her spirit already. The next spring, a single white flower bloomed from the ashes, a bloom no one could name, its petals shaped like small blades. The people began to leave bits of linen there, offerings not for the gods, but for her. She was not alone in her choice. Across the north, other women followed widows, forced into remarriage, concubines given as gifts, thralls whose children had been taken. Some drowned in the fjords, some leapt from cliffs, others walked into the forests with knives hidden beneath their cloaks. The men called it weakness, the women called it returning to themselves. In time, Those deaths took on a strange reverence. Fishermen left a blade on the shore before sailing. For the ones who chose, they said, believing such spirits guided the lost safely home. And when lightning struck a hall or a ship sank without warning, people whispered that the women had turned their knives skyward, cutting open the heavens themselves. No one carved their names on stone. No songs were sung. Yet their defiance endured in silence, proof that even in a world built to cage them, a single edge could still draw a line between suffering and freedom. When the age of the raids finally faded, and the longships rotted in their sheds, the North grew quiet. The wars had ended, the gods had grown still, and yet the silence that followed was not peace. It was the sound of a world trying to forget what it had done. The men built churches where temples once stood. The seeresses were gone, replaced by priests who spoke of forgiveness instead of fate. But the women, those who had survived the centuries of conquest, sacrifice, and servitude, carried memories too heavy for prayers. They did not speak of them. They simply learned to live in the echo. In the villages, the old laws were rewritten. Slavery was outlawed, but the chains remained. Only now they were hidden beneath marriage and duty. A wife could not be sold, but she could not leave. A mother could not be claimed as property, but her children still bore their father's name and none of her own. The past had only changed its language. The sagas that survived into the New Age told of glory kings, crowned ships gilded, the triumph of new faith. They forgot the thralls. They forgot the women who had laboured in the shadows, who had carried the weight of the world on their backs while their masters prayed for honour. But silence has a way of keeping its own record. In the far corners of the fjords, travellers still found cairns built of small stones, not graves, but memorials with no names. Women had raised them in secret, marking the places where their mothers had been taken, their sisters lost, their daughters buried. At night, the wind moving through those stones sounded almost like voices. Some said it was grief, others said it was gratitude that the dead were speaking to those who had outlasted them. The Christians called such murmurs superstition, but they could not stop the stories. In every settlement, an old woman could be found who remembered one tale or another. The thrall who escaped, the queen who vanished, the seeress who defied the gods. They would tell them softly, as if afraid to wake the ghosts, yet unwilling to let them sleep completely. In time, those stories bled into legend, and legend into myth. The women who had once been captives became figures of warning and reverence, not saints, but survivors. Their faces blurred, their names forgotten, but their presence endured in the hush between tides, in the pause before thunder, in the eyes of daughters born centuries later who still refused to kneel. The North, for all its iron and ice, learned one truth it never dared to carve in stone. Empires may rise by the sword, but they are remembered by the women who endured them. And when their voices fall silent, the world forgets until the silence itself begins to speak again.